agriculture is really about increasing plants and animals in the environment that we benefit from. A German chemist figured out how to actually break that nitrogen apart, combine it with some other things, and create an inorganic form of nitrogen that plants can readily take up. That process is called the Haber-Bosch process.
How can we maybe design this system that is balancing those two things, and we're not destroying the planet, but we also can feed everybody?
Can you insert genes that when an insect feeds on it, if it's a very specific kind of insect, it will release a protein that is only toxic to that particular insect.
Genetically modified food, and a lot of people have a lot of skepticism, and they think it's like fake food, it's not healthy for you. Is this really true?
One of the most commonly used genetically modified organisms that we have in the environment right now are those that have a trait that makes plants resistant to herbicides.
Welcome. This is an Hour of Innovation podcast, and I'm your host, Lyoshin. Dr. Claudio Gratton joins me today to explore how agriculture technology, biodiversity, and ecological innovations can create sustainable farming systems, avoid unintended consequences, and educate the public on the future of food and ecosystems. Welcome, Claudio. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we start with learning a little bit about you and your research and how it connects to agriculture.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, my journey to agriculture. So first of all, I'm an entomologist. An entomologist is somebody who works with insects. And some of your audience might be asking, well, what is somebody who works on insects on a technology and innovations podcast? And my journey to agriculture has been a bit indirect. Currently, I do a lot of work on insects that we as people consider beneficial. Things like predatory insects, things that eat other insects, and pollinating insects, insects that actually will move pollen around between plants and allow them to pollinate and create fruit. And so when you apply those, when you think about those in agricultural systems, then we see value in those particular organisms, and we call them beneficial. So that's kind of how I got started. Is I had been working on predatory insects, predator-prey interactions, trying to understand why certain insects are more common in some places than others. How do predators fit into that? And when I landed here at the University of Wisconsin, I started getting interested in the landscapes that were around me, which were primarily agricultural. And I can tell you more about what an agricultural landscape looks like as we get more into it. And I started getting interested in how we manage our landscapes and how we manage agriculture and what effects that has on these beneficial organisms out there. And what can we do to make those organisms do more of that, do more of those things that we care about. So that's kind of how my journey as an entomologist kind of went more into agriculture. And lately I've been thinking a lot about what are the innovations that we could be developing or that we are developing that are relevant to using more ecologically based approaches to managing our ecosystems, our agricultural ecosystems. So that's kind of where, how my journey has progressed.
Okay, that's great. And then, so since you're interested in systems and technologies a little bit, at least, what are some of the breakthrough technologies that you know about from the last decade, let's say?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, it's probably worth even kind of rewinding the clock a little bit, thinking about, what is agriculture and why, what kinds of innovations even come into agriculture and why do we need them? And so agriculture is really about increasing plants and animals in the environment that we benefit from. So if you're growing crops, you're growing more of them. And if you're trying to create fruits, making bigger ones or ones that taste better or have more nutrition. And so people modify the environment so that we can grow them better, bigger, more abundant in ways that, and then we make use of those things. And we do the same with animals too. We We breed them, we raise them, and then we harvest them, we slaughter them, and use them for food. So that's basically what agriculture is. And if you think about it from a plant perspective, plants have some critical limitations that they are trying to overcome. They need light. This is back from like high school biology here. So they need light, they need water, and they need nutrients. And in particular, they need nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and a bunch of micronutrients. And they generally do better when they're not stressed, and they become stressed in a variety of ways. They become stressed when they don't have those critical, needs, light, water, nutrients. And they also get stressed when they get eaten by other things, or when those nutrients are taken up by other organisms, things that compete with us. Things like other insects that actually eat, our plants, or pathogens or bacteria or viruses that are using up the plant material that we want to harvest, but the bacteria is using it for food for them. These are things we call pests. So, in an agricultural system, we try to get rid of the pests and we try to alleviate those limiting resources: water, nutrients, light, and so on. To do this requires people. This doesn't happen magically on its own. And so people create an environment where plants have everything that they need and none of the things that they don't need, like those stressors that we talked about. So if you go back to the history of agriculture and you look at the innovations that emerged to kind of support that agriculture, you see some really basic things like irrigation. Taking water from places where it's abundant and bringing it to places that are not as abundant. Fertilizer. One of the biggest innovations in agriculture in the last century was the creation of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which occurs through a very energy-intensive process. Nitrogen is one of the most common elements that we have in our biosphere, but it's locked up in a form that is inaccessible to most organisms, including plants. And a German chemist figured out how to actually break that nitrogen apart, combine it with some other things, and create an inorganic form of nitrogen that plants can readily take up. That process is called the Haber-Bosch process. So this has probably been one of the most revolutionary things that has happened in agriculture in the last 100 years. So these are examples of things that go to overcoming those limitations that the plants need. Some other really amazing technologies that happened also kind of in that same time period in the early 1920s and 30s was the development of a series of chemicals that are very toxic to things like insects. They also are toxic to mammals, some of them. Some of them are toxic to other plants that we can use in agriculture to alleviate those herbivores, those pests that eat the crops that we care about. So these are been some key innovations, all aimed at kind of overcoming those resource limitations. You asked the question of so what about the last 10 years? What have we been seeing? Oh, I want to add another category to that, which is one of the other limiting factors. I said that people do agriculture. One of the other limiting factors is that agriculture is hard work. It takes a lot of people energy to actually do it. Back in the old days, you had a hoe and you kind of, hoed the earth so that you could plant your seeds in there. As things, the development of the plow was a major, breakthrough. A method to actually, turn the soil over, with the plow. Seems simple, but it was really an important innovation there. Mechanization of agriculture has been a major series of technologies that have really advanced it and allowed it to scale beyond what you can do in your own backyard. Now you can have tractors instead of horses pulling plows, automated harvesting or threshing equipment. So these are all things that basically were done by hand once upon a time, that now, because of mechanization that happened during the Industrial Revolution, we could really expand agriculture in a way that we couldn't before. So I kind of set the scene there where it's water limitation, through irrigation, fertilizer through the Haber-Bosch process, mechanization of agriculture through various machinery. Now that became, like engines that were being developed at the turn of the century. Those were all things, and chemistries that, killed off pests. Those were things that really allowed agriculture to start to expand. Starting in the 1950s, in the post-war era, a lot of these technologies actually were found to have really important uses during the Second World War, during the wartime period. As that excess capacity during the World War II was no longer needed to fight wars, and you were starting to rebuild Europe and to kind of bring people out of kind of the ruins of that devastating World War. A lot of those technologies were then applied to agriculture to expand and create and increase food production, so that people could be pulled out of poverty and out of starvation, which was really critical in post-war Europe at that time. So, starting in the 1950s, there was a couple of other technologies that really emerged that were important. One was the kind of the breeding of plants to be really responsive to those nitrogen fertilizers, and to have incredibly high yields. So the plant breeders and the plant geneticists developed traits of these plants that became super yielding, you could think of that. And in fact, they were super yielding, especially because you could add these synthetic fertilizers and keep all the insects away because you could spray pesticides. The beginning of that period, kind of that post-war period in the 1950s and 60s, through really kind of where we are today. Maybe some people kind of put that era kind of ending in the 1980s, sometimes referred to as the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution was kind of the confluence of plant breeding, agrochemicals, mechanization, and really allowing agriculture to produce much more than we did even 50 years before. And some people would credit those kinds of technologies in allowing a lot of countries to be able to feed their growing populations. In Asia, Southeast Asia, and other places, starvation was really a key thing. There were a lot of geopolitics at play at that time. Who is going to have most influence around the world via the food assistance. And so there was the Cold War was happening at that time. And so whereas there was the Cold War, on one side, and the Red Revolution that was happening, there was the Green Revolution on the other side. So the geopolitics of communism and capitalism in the Western world was playing out in agriculture. And so these technologies really allowed countries like the United States to have this undue kind of global influence because of their ability to export these technologies. So these were really important technologies that we've seen kind of refined and built on through the 1980s, 1990s, and they continue today, really. What your question was like, okay, recently, what are we seeing that is kind of happening? And then kind of what's on the horizon, maybe that might be a future question. So apart from like getting really good at plant breeding, in the last 10 years, people started looking at, I would kind of put it back even maybe the last 20 or 30 years, people started looking at more advanced ways of doing that plant breeding. So the concept of genetic technologies or genetically modified organisms or biotechnologies really started taking off in the plant protection world and in the plant breeding world. And we can talk about genetically modified organisms as a technology, as a genetic technology that allows you to do things that would have taken decades before to breed a plant that has certain traits and characteristics to it. In the last 10 years, what's really happened is the data revolution, and the use of sensors, data coming from in the farm, from satellites, from sensors and models that are kind of ingesting large quantities of data to tell us things about how are my crops doing, where should I be fertilizing in a field, and what can I do to enhance the production within my field, within my farm, given that I know now something about where some of these stressors are and what these limitations actually are. So Whereas agriculture 3.0 might have been sometimes referred to as the green revolution. Sometimes this next phase of innovation is being referred to as agriculture 4.0, kind of the new green revolution. And the confluence of data, sensors, algorithms, precision agriculture, sometimes referred to as digital agriculture. That is kind of what's been brewing right now, and where the field is definitely kind of expanding into.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the history of evolution of all these technologies and everything. That's helpful. Um, And then, so it sounds like this whole agriculture system basically combines all these different technologies from ancient times to modern days. And now it's kind of a challenge that we have. When, on one side, we have people who want to produce as much as possible to feed people and animals and things like that. And on the other side, we have people who care about environment and how to protect it and how to balance natural things, right? And
Yeah.
protect land. So, in your opinion, how can we maybe design this system that is balancing those two things, and we're not destroying the planet, but we also can feed everybody?
Yeah, really great question. So all of those technologies that I talked about, starting from the green revolution, kind of coming into the data revolution, um, um, we've been learning have had these massive consequences for the planet.
Mm-hmm.
On the positive side, they've generated a tremendous amount of food, brought people out of poverty, alleviated starvation, and generally improved people's well-being from that perspective. There's been a lot of consequences of doing that. For example, when you fertilize plants, if you don't do it just right, a lot of those fertilizers are not maintained in the soil, are not captured by the plants, but they leach out of the soil and into our waterways. When that happens, they pollute your drinking water, and it's actually toxic for us to drink it. It affects our bodies. You heard about polluted drinking waters in cities like Flint, Michigan. That was lead and other things, but there's also nitrate in water that is dangerous for people. When it gets into our waterways, there's other organisms that can take advantage of all those fertilizers, all those nutrients, and some of those are algae. And different kinds of algae will bloom in lakes and make them completely unusable for people and for fish. A lot of those that in the North America, the amount of agriculture that we do with all of the tons and tons of fertilizer that's added to it eventually concentrates and flows down the Mississippi River and into the Gulf of Mexico. And the algae go crazy at the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico. And by doing that, they use up a lot of oxygen. You need oxygen to grow. If you're an organism, most organisms need oxygen, which completely depletes the oxygen and creates what are referred to as dead zones in this body of water. And when that happens, other organisms can't live there. So the shrimping industry has had to go further and further out to sea because of these dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. You get fish kills in lakes and a bunch of other things. So there was a positive aspect of using fertilizer, but there's a negative aspect, which is it's hard to keep in the field, and there's these consequences, which have environmental consequences. Now, pesticides come in two different flavors. There's herbicides that kill plants, and there's insecticides that kill insects. If it kills an insect, most of them are pretty indiscriminate. It's an insecticide. So you're going to kill the bad ones that are eating your plants, but you're also going to kill the good guys, like the ones that I study that are trying to make a living out there. So the predators, the pollinators, the decomposers, all also get affected by these insecticides. Different insecticides have different consequences for different groups, but by and large, though, they're insecticides. They're meant to kill insects, so they're going to have some impact in some way. And so we've seen these incredible declines in our biodiversity, insects in particular, but birds and a bunch of other things as well, that people have pointed to insecticides and the way that we do agriculture as one of the primary drivers in which we've affected our biodiversity. So you said very correctly that there actually have been environmental consequences. These are some of the environmental consequences that we look at. And so the question is, like, we've created these systems that are finely tuned, that are very, what people refer to as efficient. On a small amount of land, you could generate a lot of food, but there's all these side effects of that. There's all these unintended consequences of that. And so how do we take a step back from the way that we currently do things and think about, like, so if you're trying to kill another insect that's inside of a field, what is it that we would have to put in place in order for the natural ecological processes, like the activity of those lady beetles, the predators that I work on, what would we have to put in place in order to ensure that they could do their job and actually suppress those populations? So that's kind of the where the field is trying to go. It's like, how do we not sacrifice some of that production? The reality is we probably produce more than enough food right now for the people that need it. We have other problems in distribution and poverty that makes it hard for people and countries that need food to actually buy it. There's a lot of challenges with the way our food systems are set up that exacerbate some of these problems. But creating up the quantity of food that we need is probably not one of them. We probably generate plenty of food right now, and could do a lot better, even with the growing population. But how do we do it in a way that doesn't have all these negative consequences? So yeah, how do we balance that? And relying on those ecological interactions is going to be one of those ways that we can kind of take our foot off of the pedal, so to speak, be less dependent on agrochemicals, and which include fertilizers and the pesticides, so that we can see if we can generate that amount of food without those inputs that we know have all those side effects.
Okay. And then are there any specific researches going on and some ideas maybe about how to solve it? Like, I know sometimes they were talking about, I forgot what the technology is called, but they basically plant like natural grass in between the fields to kind of have restoration of the soil and habitat for those insects and birds, so they can naturally eat all the bad guys and keep the plants grow. Anything
Absolutely.
like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you're referring to something that's plays out in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's called cover crops. Sometimes it's companion crops. Sometimes it's non-crop plants that are grown there. I'll say a little bit more about that in just a second. One of the other things that's happened in our quest for efficiency and productivity is that in order to be really efficient in the way that we grow things, we tend to plant most of a field into one thing. So, like, if you're going to grow corn, if you're going to grow soybean, you're just going to plant corn, or you're just going to plant soybean. And you're going to have large harvesters and planters that allow you to very quickly plant things, harvest them, fertilize them, spray them, do all those things. So there's an efficiency by having that can be scaled, primarily due to the mechanization that's there, that also simplifies our landscapes. Now we have places in the Midwest, where I am right now, in the Midwestern US, that are entirely dominated by just a handful of crops. Corn, soybean, where I am, alfalfa, that is used as a food, as a forage for livestock primarily. This type of simplification makes it really hard to support organisms that need a diversity of diets, that need shelter at certain times of the year. And so the kind of work that people are thinking about, people are doing, is like, how do we reintroduce, or how do we re-diversify our agricultural systems, so that if we're trying to support those organisms that are needed for agriculture to succeed without agricultural inputs, like, what are we doing to create those habitats, those needs to meet those needs that they actually have? And so things like what you just mentioned, Vit, is diversifying by not just having corn in one area, but maybe having corn and some other things that could support those organisms at a time when maybe there is nothing to eat in the corn. Maybe there's something else that could be present there. So those are the kinds of things that could be done. So rediversifying it in a variety of different ways. One of the things that has happened in this transition in agriculture as we've gotten more and more intensified is that we've grown fewer and fewer things, fewer and fewer crops within the landscapes that we live in. So, here in Wisconsin in the early 1950s, an individual farmer may have been growing wheat, may have been growing some corn, may have grown some potatoes, maybe grew sugar beets for part of the year, had a variety of things all on the same farm. Right now, sugar beet production has been mostly done in Colorado, and it's mostly done in parts of Minnesota. If you're growing alfalfa, you grow it in Wisconsin, but you might also grow it in some other couple of other places. So we've gotten rid of that. So how do we create opportunities for farmers to become more diversified in their systems? It's hard to do if there's nobody there to buy your products. If there's no supply chain, that has a processor that has a factory near where you are. So if you're growing sugar beets, it would be great. But if there's no processor, then what are you going to do with them? You're going to ship them to Colorado? That doesn't make a lot of sense. So we've, in our quest to kind of create these technologically efficient and modernized systems, we've actually simplified them to the point where that lack of diversity has actually made them very susceptible to shocks, to changes in markets, to changes in climate. Now you literally have all your eggs in one basket. That's like if you're a farmer and you only grow corn, the price of corn falls through the floor because of some global trade dispute or, tariffs or things like that. That is going to have a big effect on your ability to maintain a productive enterprise. And so, how do we re-diversify landscapes also has to do with how do we create a system that allows farmers to be successful, that allows them to have outlets for their production so that they're not just locked into growing one or two different things. So I think your question is where is this happening? How is it happening? It's happening very slowly. But once you get that lock-in, it's actually very difficult to undo. It's very difficult to kind of back out of it and create opportunities for diversification. So some of this diversification that we're seeing is things like that is primarily geared towards soil health. The use of cover crops, which is like the growing of grasses during times when the crop isn't there, has been very helpful for holding onto the soil, holding onto some nutrients. You can also grow some lady beetles in those at certain parts of the season. But then we immediately go back to the monocultures that we had before, single crops at a time. So it's been very challenging because of these system level, what we refer to as lock-ins, that make it very hard to change the system.
Yeah, because I remember even in my childhood, I'm from Kazakhstan, where probably in beginning of 90s, when we used to go to our country house, we were passing these fields, and in the middle of the field, it's maybe wheat, but then around it, maybe peas, or maybe sunflowers, or maybe something else, right, on the perimeter of that field. And fields were very small. They were not huge ones. So I think those kind of things also help to attract different species to be on the fields.
Absolutely. Yeah. You've hit on a couple of really key things. And one of the things that we see here when you increase this mechanization and you increase, your quest is to produce more at the expense of a lot of other things, you tend to see this increase in field size. Now, when you have small fields like the ones that you're describing, what you often have is between the fields, there's a little bit of a border, a little bit of an alleyway where there's some grasses that are growing there, where it doesn't get tilled, perhaps. Those are shelters for a lot of those beneficial insects that then can move into the adjacent fields. And if the fields are small, they have the opportunity to get all the way to the middle of a field. If your field is only, a couple 100 feet wide, because that's as big as your tractor is, or a couple of passes of your tractor, the likelihood that a little predatory spider or lady beetle or something can crawl into the field is much greater than if you have fields that are hundreds and hundreds of acres, large. Then you're asking a lot for these organisms to kind of fly in and colonize and, not get killed when they spray insecticides in them. So field size actually is one of those things that is a way that we can increase the diversity of our landscapes in a way that we haven't been doing it.
Mm-hmm.
In parts of the world, this is much more common. In Japan, you see this. In Northern Europe, you see this. In Italy, where I grew up, you see this a lot more. The idea of a field being bigger than 100 acres is like, oh, you're a big farmer if you're more than 100 acres. Those are very unusual sizes when you get to that size in a lot of parts of the world. Yeah.
So you also mentioned a little bit earlier about biotechnologies, and I had somebody recently on the podcast. She has a startup that AI helps them figure out new ingredients for cosmetics and for food, not necessarily the whole crop. Like they don't invent a new carrot or new potato, but just ingredients for, for mixes and things like that, for cosmetics, like fats and proteins primarily. Have you seen anything similar when they do with biotech for the whole crop, maybe? For new grains or just more sustainable grains or something like that?
Yeah, this is like an area that is really like shown a lot of opportunity is what you can do with targeted modification of plants so that they have particular traits that you really care about. Mm-hmm. So some of the things, for example, that people are really interested in are like, can we create more drought tolerant plants, for example? There's parts of the world where you have a decrease in the amount of water because of climate change. So can you breed plants that are less needy of water? Maybe the cells are smaller, maybe they have particular traits that allow them to withstand, osmotic pressure imbalances in the cells. Maybe there's clever ways to move salts in and out of cells. There's all kinds of physiological ways in which plants deal with water deficits. Maybe you can tweak some genes that allow you to do those kinds of things. So that is one of the things that people are looking at is drought tolerant plants. Mm-hmm. Another thing that people are doing is breeding plants and genetically modifying plants to make them more resistant to particular kinds of pests. So this is at the plant level. Can you insert genes that when an insect feeds on it, if it's a very specific kind of insect, it will release a protein that is only toxic to that particular insect. So rather than spraying insecticides over an entire field, can you kind of target the delivery of a toxin to a particular kind of insect that you don't want there? So there's a lot of interest in some of the new technologies that are specific to those kinds of things. I wish there was more on things like flavor and nutrients and things like that. There's a little bit. Some of the original technologies, genetically modified, crops that were approved in the U.S. were actually traits that made tomatoes easier to transport, that they wouldn't spoil as quickly. And that, as it turns out, also were tasteless, but they became some of the more widespread things because they were easy to put in a box and send all over the country without worry of spoilage. So there are traits that are trying to make them more resistant to to desiccating and to rotting and things like that. So those are the kinds of traits that people have looked at. There are some folks that are actually looking at traits in plants that, when they are damaged by an insect, actually release volatiles. So release chemicals that become airborne that then become detected by those predatory insects or parasitic insects that then fly in and go, hey, I think I smell something that's been damaged, and they can then find specifically where those pest insects actually occur. So people are looking at the signaling of the plants that have been shown to be attractive to those beneficial insects, and seeing if we can upregulate those and make them more efficient at having them find the particular damaged plant. So those are the kinds of really interesting and exciting things that
Yeah.
are happening there.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And then I always ask this about genetically modified food, and a lot of people have a lot of skepticism, and they think it's like fake food, it's not healthy for you. Is this really true?
Yeah, there's been a lot of study on this. There was a panel from the National Academy of Sciences a few years back that did really an extensive, um, study of like what do we know about the safety of these
Mm-hmm.
genetically modified foods, and the conclusion that expert panel really came to was, it's very difficult to see any health effects, of these genetically modified organisms for the most part, when it's done correctly. The genes that are targeted and that are changed in these plants produce proteins that are predictable, and those proteins have a particular effect, and so it's no different than the plant making it itself. Sometimes it's a little weird where you're finding a protein that used to be made by a bacterium actually being made by the plant, but it's still the same protein, and we know what the functions of those proteins actually are.
Mm-hmm.
So, from the human safety and human health perspective, there's not been a lot of evidence that that's actually had any effect. Now, there are other biosafety questions that come up with some genetically modified organisms, and they fall into two different categories. One is that some of these traits, some of these plants, when they, the genes of these plants are captured within every cell. When pollen moves from one plant to the other, it's moving those genes with it. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's been demonstration that some of these genes that have been genetically modified within some plants have actually been moving into wild existent plants. So there's been the movement. So the idea was that, like, no, those genes are only confined to the crop plants. Well, that's actually not true. There's been some leakage of those genes into the natural environment. And so then we have to start asking, like, what are the consequences of having some of these, bacterially produced genes now in some of our wild plants out there? How do we prevent that from actually happening? Is there going to be, and these genes have some characteristics that are not necessarily desirable in a wild plant. So one of the most commonly used genetically modified organisms that we have in the environment right now are those that have a trait that makes plants resistant to herbicides. Now, you might ask yourself, like, why would you want to do that? The most common trait is one that makes corn, this is used in corn, to a lesser extent, soybeans, one that makes corn resistant to the herbicide Roundup. Well, what you can do then is you can plant hundreds and hundreds of acres of corn. A couple of weeks later, go through, spray with herbicides. The corn plants are going to be resistant to those herbicides because they
Mm-hmm.
have those genetically modified, they've been genetically
Right.
modified to be resistant to herbicide. But all of the other plants that are in that cornfield are susceptible, and so they die.
Mm-hmm.
So that is probably the most common genetically modified trait that we actually see in our environment right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then you ask yourself, okay, what happens if herbicide resistance makes it into a wild plant? Now, when you
Mm-hmm.
start spraying, the environment to get rid of so-called weeds, some of those may actually be genetically resistant. The other thing that's done is actually in the second category of kind of unintended consequences, perhaps, of genetically modified organisms, is that we use more and more of these chemicals in the environment. We spray more and more Roundup out there. And so the incidence of resistance, natural evolutionary resistance to those herbicides has really increased dramatically in the last 20 years as we've been spraying more and more of these herbicides out there.
Mm-hmm.
So your question was, is this harmful for humans? Probably not as we eat it, but there's all kinds of other, maybe, downstream effects of having these genetically modified organisms in the landscape.
Yeah.
The other big one that I want to touch on, because I think it's going to get into this question of, like, how do we actually, like, think about these technologies in agriculture, and what's the responsible way to actually develop them and kind of get them out there?
Mm-hmm.
The other one that is that has really people, concerned is that it takes a lot of money to develop these genetic technologies. The companies that do it are large corporations that then own the intellectual property and the patents to those particular traits and those particular plants. And it's very expensive to actually use them. If you're a farmer and you want to buy plants that have those traits, you pay a premium, to have that trait in there, those genetically modified traits. And so what's ended up happening is that because of just the way the plant breeding works, it's expensive, it requires a lot of expertise, there's a lot of research and development that goes into that. The power is concentrated into the hands of a few multinational corporations, which then can decide what prices to set. And it makes it harder, if you're a farmer trying to compete, if you're a corn farmer and you're trying to compete in a market where if you've got that trait, you produce a little extra of your, yield because you don't have any weed pressure. It's going to be that much harder for you to compete, with others that do have that. To get that extra competition, you have to go to these large corporations. So it's had the effect of concentrating power into the hands of fewer and fewer, larger and larger corporations, and that's really unbalanced kind of the technology development in the world, the investment in research and development. And that's got a big social and competitive kind of effects on how innovation actually happens.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea for somebody out there to leverage AI. Just like my other guest, she's using it for identifying ingredients. Somebody can use it to identify those traits and actually develop them somehow. Because she was saying that they can reduce the time to find a new ingredient to like a couple months versus like few years as big corporations do it. So much faster, so much cheaper. And that would be great if somebody can take on this problem.
So there are people that are working on technologies. For example, imagine if you could take a camera, a very special camera, shine it onto the leaf of a plant and actually detect the spectral signatures of that plant and figure out, does it have the chemicals that you want in it or not? If you could do this, over and over and over for every single plant that you've crossbred with every single other one and find the one that's got that trait that you're looking for, then you just pick that one and breed that one, and so you can accelerate your breeding programs by what's called rapid phenotyping. The phenotype is the traits that the plant actually has. And so there are technologies that allow you to screen many more, plants and do that breeding in a lot, in a much better way for the traits that you're even interested in.
Yeah. That's also just on a side note. It always amazes me how people think genetically modifications are bad and engineering is so unhealthy or so forth. But it's actually been happening with people doing this for many thousands of years ago, right? It just took years, hundreds of years to come up with a new corn or whatever. When I saw some pictures online from like how 5,000 or 500 years ago watermelon looked like, or lemon or avocado, which the seed was huge and the actual eatable part was very tiny. And now we have opposite for avocados. And everybody is concerned about that. And I think it's actually pretty good that we speed up this process of modifying foods so we can actually eat more.
Or have more nutritious foods or more different types of foods that have characteristics that we want. So I think that the knock with a lot of these technologies is that they tend to be developed, even back to the examples that I used at the very beginning, they tend to be developed to solve a singular problem. And the reality is agriculture is multidimensional. It has got a lot of different components to it. And when we solve individual problems, we often create other problems. And so the challenge with developing technologies is like, how do we anticipate those unintended consequences? Who gets to decide what those technologies actually are? Do we need a genetically modified corn plant that is herbicide resistant? Is that something that actually the public actually needs? Because now we've got to dump a lot more chemicals into the environment to actually do that. Is this actually a good thing? Do we want all that Roundup to be out there? Roundup, by the way, is, debated as being a carcinogen, and there's been demonstration of, significant health effects, cancer clusters in various parts of the world where the rampant use of agrochemicals like Roundup have actually been used. And so there's this trade-off with human health as well. It's like, are we okay with that? All to get that extra couple of bushels of corn or whatever it is. Who gets to decide those things? Is it a company? Just because we can do it, we should allow it to actually happen? Or should there be some public oversight on like what is an appropriate development of technology that we might want to put out there? Is it okay that all we do is grow corn? Maybe that diversity, that we talked about, like ways to kind of enhance the ecological capacities of a system so that we don't have to use agrochemical inputs because of all of the downstream consequences. Like, what are the technologies that we're developing that are actually supporting that? Why aren't we investing in those? When you're putting all your money into, genetically modified organisms or other kind of cool tech kinds of approaches, you're going to have great success with those individual things, but you're not really necessarily going to improve human health at the end of that. You're not going to improve environmental health, or at least that needs to be scrutinized from that perspective. But you might make a large corporation a lot of money, if you develop that. And so that's where kind of this area of like, how do we rebalance the innovation arena that is associated with agriculture so that we create space to enhance the ecological, capacity of an agro-ecosystem to actually do those things that right now we're substituting with synthetic inputs in a lot of ways. So how do we like rethink innovations, in a slightly more diverse and pluralistic way than we think about them right now?
Yeah. I think if you put this all to corporation hands, they obviously want to make profit of this and grow and sell as much as possible, which is fine to some degree because we need to feed people, to feed animals. But then there has to be some sort of government regulations or world regulations on what is acceptable and what is not for health and for environment and for things like that. So that balance needs to be there. Just like with medicine, for example, with pharmacy, right? You can develop some medicine, but you have to get through approvals, and it takes years and years to test, to verify, clinical trials, all this stuff. So I think it's challenge. It takes a lot of time, but I think it has to be done for a longer good.
Yeah, absolutely. And the agrochemical companies would argue that they go through a very rigorous safety process. There needs to be an explanation of the human health toxicity. There's supposed to be some toxicity done against bees and other things. The restrictions need to be put on the label. The label can be quite restrictive in where you can use it and how you can use it. So they'll sit behind that and say, well, actually, we are very safe and we are trying to minimize the impact on the environment. And I'm glad that's happening compared to not having any regulations at all. The other question, though, however, is like, yeah, but by doing that, are we actually improving human outcomes at the end? When you're talking about, okay, we might not be making people any sicker because we now have chemicals that don't have as high mammalian toxicity that we spray out there. But why do we have a system that requires insecticides in the first place? Why is it that this is the tactic that we use to actually advance our production goals? And this is back to the thread that we were pulling on earlier, which is like, well, what would we do if we wanted to like step away from that as our first line of thinking about pest management or whatever it is, the chemical input method, and build the natural capacity of a system to actually do that? Can we make it efficient enough or scalable enough that it's not happening on small little farms, for example? Well, how about doing some investments in innovation to actually give tools to people to actually do that instead of the biosafety testing about, it's not going to kill you if you spray it in these particular ways, or something like that. So I'd love to see kind of an innovation ecosystem around agriculture that actually also tries to innovate in the ecological direction, and favors that as a first line of a defense rather than the reactive approach, which is, oh, now we have a problem. How do we fix this particular problem? In the human health example that you gave, it's like saying, I have a terrible, heartburn all the time. I have just the pill for you. Let's give you some Prilosec. I've consumed my share of Zantac and Prilosec in my life. I'm glad they occur, they exist, because that's quite a painful thing to go through. But really, it's only treating the symptoms. The real causes of that is really what we should be innovating on. It's like, what can we do to restructure our systems so that we're not just treating the symptoms of a problem? The reason we have pest outbreaks is because we've created systems that are susceptible to pests. So let's think about innovation in a different way. Let's bring technology to that to help it. I love technologies, but let's redirect those energies so that we can actually start getting at the causes of these problems in the first place, rather than just like doing the whack-a-mole of like, okay, let's fix this symptom, let's fix this symptom here and there. And we're in a treadmill. In fact, it's often called a pesticide treadmill of as soon as you fix one problem, another one pops up, and you've got another chemical to throw at it like that.
Yeah.
But that's because we haven't really gotten at the causes of this. And the causes are going to require a different kind of innovation, an innovation that thinks about redesigning systems so that the landscape and your crops don't get sick in the first place. It's like, obviously me being able to treat my stress levels had a big impact on whether I needed to take Prilosec or not after that. So that's the analogy that I think is actually quite apt with like how we innovate right now in our agricultural systems.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe one of the tactics could be looking at some other fields and areas, how people solving problems, and seeing maybe not exactly what they're doing or how they innovate, right? But some ideas may be applicable here. We have other industries like not necessarily farming, maybe, but maybe animals or fish or oceans, some other areas where we get food from, and maybe there's something done that works there, and we can apply to crops as well.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. I think ultimately what it comes down to is if you are designing a technological solution to fix a very particular problem, you often do it without seeing it as a system. And so you get very good at fixing, this one little thing, but the rest of the system usually keeps creating that outcome all the time. And so anytime, this is like engineers have actually spent a lot of time thinking about complex systems and how do we actually like optimize a particular system so that we don't have those downstream problems that are not really well addressed by fixing that, that little thing that's coming out at the back end. But maybe rearranging the system, the way the pieces are linked, is the way to actually go. In cities, we often think about like, why is it that we have traffic jams always in this one area? Like, what can we do, to get, to alleviate these problems? Well, maybe it's because affordable housing doesn't exist in the places where the jobs are, and the affordable housing is further away. There's no transportation systems, and so you build roads, and then suddenly you get traffic jams, and so like you can make more lanes of highway, but you haven't really gotten at the problem of like where do people live? Where is the affordable housing shortage? So I think you're absolutely right. I think we can draw inspiration from systems level problems by looking at a lot of different challenges that we deal with in society that really at their core, the really hard ones, are systems problems. They're not like, how do we produce a bigger plant? They're like, we're trying to feed more people. How do we actually make sure that people are fed? Well, maybe it's like, how do we actually get food to them? Maybe that's actually the problem, or how do we alleviate poverty because the food is there, they just can't buy it, So those are like thinking about the problem as a systems level problem. And the really challenging things about agriculture is that unlike a car, which is a system, or a computer program, which is a system, or, other things that are machines, which are finely tuned systems, agriculture is often referred to as a socio-ecological system. Yes, there's a series of interacting components which are biological. It's things eating other things. It's plants absorbing carbon. It's plants interacting with microbes. It's like predators eating like there's an ecological system there, but it's also a social system because we create it. We arrange it in a particular way. And that makes it really interesting and very challenging because people are much harder to figure out than lady beetles. I'll tell you right now. We can do all kinds of studies on lady beetles, and they behave in relatively predictable ways. When you talk about people, now you're talking about values, you're talking about priorities, you're talking about politics, you're talking about ethics. So this question of the genetically modified organisms that you brought up, it's like, is it bad for people? It's probably not bad for your health, but there may be other reasons why you may have reasons why you might not appreciate having those organisms in the environment. In Mexico, for example, genetically modified corn in particular is not allowable. It's not, because corn, maize, is a plant that has deep historical cultural roots. It was part of the civilizations there that emerged over millennia that were dependent on this particular plant. And so the idea that we would allow genes to kind of be thrown into these plants willy-nilly by laboratory scientists is really kind of goes against the fiber of like, what does it mean to be part of this community and part of this world? It has a cultural value and a cultural significance. And we can't ignore that,
Mm-hmm.
So that suddenly it's like you have a technological solution, but it's not really appropriate for every parts of the world. And that's
Yeah.
because there's a social context that we have to think about. And those are really important things to consider as we're developing these agricultural innovations as well.
Yeah, for sure. Those cultural things can affect what people eat. Like in every culture, they have very specific cuisine preferences, I should say,
Absolutely.
and you can't ignore that. If you have a cookie cutter solution for everything, it's not going to work, and we have to come up with something better than that. Yeah. So we're almost coming to an end here, and I just wanted to ask you if like what can ordinary people do to educate themselves or maybe help somehow or just I guess basically educate themselves better on this and just be aware of this and maybe somehow get involved.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I am so hopeful for kind of where we are right now because the conversation around food, where food comes from, how we grow food has been elevated to like the newspapers right now. We didn't really find that in the same way, other than like the farm news, kind of the local community farm news. Now people are talking about these issues. We're talking about like what are we eating and how are these things grown? What are the consequences for communities and people and the climate and the environment? Uh, Agriculture is responsible for, depending on how you measure things, up to a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions that we put out there.
Mm,
Most of it coming from animal production. So like people are thinking about like what are ways in which we can do this better, and we as consumers have the ability to make choices. At least we should have the ability to make choices. Not I mean, the reality is not everybody has the financial means or access to foods that are grown in ways that may match their desires. And so why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we creating an agriculture that has those positive outcomes for society that is not more widely available? Why do we as a society not invest in those kinds of things? Because they do have benefits for non-farming communities because we're all eaters. We all do this, hopefully a few times a day. If again we're fortunate enough to have the means to buy food, how do we make the purchasing and the availability of healthy food that's been grown by people who have been treated well, and that has that matches with the values that you have? Why is that not more widespread, and how do we actually do that? So I guess one way to get involved is like ask a lot of questions, like think about what your relationship is with food, and what decisions one is making on a daily basis that does affect the food economy that we're all part of, whether you think about it or not. Each time you eat, it's as some people have said, it's a very political act. That you're making decisions and you're putting your values out there. So I think that's a really positive thing. The other thing is to think of these challenges as systems level problems. They're not going to be solved by pointing the finger at individuals or systems to say, well, if we could just fix this one thing, then we will solve all our problems. As hopefully our conversation has taken us today has shown, these are systems level problems. And some of these are putting into full kind of contrast the private goods that come from agriculture, farm income, corporate income, economics that can be measured in dollars and cents, and the public good, which is measured in other things like clean water and stable climates and healthy rural communities and things like that. And these things are not independent of each other; they interact with each other. So we need to be thinking of an all of the above kind of solution space. How can the public sector be involved in shaping our food systems? How can people in the decisions that they make, both at the farm level and at the buying level, how does that affect our system? And then how do we help the individual producers who want to make the positive outcomes for their communities? How do we enable them to actually make those changes as well? As we said at the beginning, a lot of them are they recognize the limitations. They're not making a lot of money because of the corporate domination of the markets. It's very hard to be a farmer. Like, how do we create opportunities for them to diversify? And how do we provide additional training or tools or techniques that allow them to actually do that? We need interventions at all those levels, which means that all of us have the capacity to influence this, whether you're an engineer, whether you're an entomologist, whether you're a consumer, whether you're an educator. We all have the capacity to influence the way that we develop these new systems that provide well-being for people, agricultural systems ultimately. So there's a role for everybody to play here.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for your time, Claudio. That's been very informative and inspirational, very educational too. So thank you very much for your time and explaining all these things and answering the questions.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.